In tears, the Billionaire CEO reluctantly signed the divorce papers and threw the pregnancy test in the trash. 9 months later, what he heard at an event made him freeze in shock. Stephen Harrington sat alone in his sprawling penthouse office, the dim light of the evening casting long shadows across the mahogany desk. His signature pen rested in his trembling hand, poised above the divorce papers. The world outside continued as usual, the city's hum of activity a stark contrast to the silence that consumed him. He drew in a shaky breath, forcing himself to steady the pen, and scrawled his name on the dotted line. It was done. The sound of his signature scratching across the paper echoed in his ears, louder than the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. A flood of emotions surged within him, anger, sadness, and the bitter taste of regret. For all his power, for all his wealth, he had been powerless to save the one thing he truly cared about, his marriage to Mia. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision sinking in. Flashes of their last fight replayed in his mind, sharp and unforgiving. "You've already decided I'm the villain in this story, haven't you?" Mia's voice had been raw, her tear-filled eyes piercing through him. "You keep shutting me out, Mia." He'd shot back, his own voice trembling with frustration. "How am I supposed to fix something when I don't even know what's broken? You don't listen. You don't care to see what's right in front of you," she had yelled, her hands gesturing toward the pile of unopened letters and forgotten promises scattered across the dining table. Stephen's jaw clenched at the memory. He had tried, hadn't he? But every attempt to bridge the gap between them had been met with walls he couldn't scale. In the aftermath of that fight, silence had filled their home, more deafening than the shouting. And now, it seemed, that silence would be permanent. Rising from his chair, Stephen walked to the window, gazing at the cityscape that had once inspired him. The empire he had built was thriving, every investment and venture a testament to his relentless drive. But tonight it all felt hollow. The empire meant nothing if he had no one to share it with. His thoughts were interrupted when he glanced toward the wastebasket beside his desk. A faint pink box caught his attention, its edges protruding from beneath crumpled papers. Frowning, Stephen reached down and pulled it out. A pregnancy test. His heart skipped a beat. His mind raced. Could it be? Had Mia? He turned the box over in his hands, noticing it was open. With hesitation, he glanced at the contents. The test stick was tucked inside, its digital screen blank, the battery long dead. Memories of their final weeks together came rushing back. Mia had been distant, yes, but also different. She'd been more tired than usual, her appetite erratic, her emotions volatile. He had chalked it up to the stress of their failing marriage. Could there have been more to it? The faintest spark of hope ignited within him. If she had been pregnant, if they were going to have a child. Could that have changed things? Could it still? He shook his head, the spark extinguished as quickly as it had appeared. Mia hadn't said anything. If it were true, she would have told him. Wouldn't she? Stephen's grip on the test tightened as he wrestled with the what-ifs, but a darker voice in his mind warned him not to go down that road. Hope had been a dangerous thing for him lately. It had led him to believe they could fix what had been broken. It had kept him clinging to a marriage that was already over. He tossed the test back into the trash, dismissing the thought entirely. It didn't matter. Whatever it was, whatever it could have been, Mia clearly didn't want him to know. That was the final blow, he decided. If she had kept something so monumental from him, it was because she had already made her choice. Stephen grabbed his coat and headed for the door. The house he and Mia had shared was eerily quiet when he arrived. The staff had long since left for the evening, leaving the sprawling space empty and lifeless. He walked through the familiar halls, each step heavier than the last. Memories clung to every corner of the house, their laughter echoing through the living room, late-night talks in the kitchen, the way she'd dance barefoot on the balcony when she thought no one was watching. He stopped at the threshold of their bedroom, unable to step inside. The bed was perfectly made, the way she always insisted it be. The faint scent of her perfume lingered in the air, a cruel reminder of her absence. Forcing himself to move, Stephen made his way to the closet. He didn't take much, a few suits, some casual clothes, and his favorite watch. As he packed, he caught sight of Mia's side of the closet, her clothes still neatly hung, her shoes perfectly aligned. His gaze landed on a small box tucked in the corner, one he hadn't noticed before. It was filled with items he recognized, mementos of their life together. Photos, concert tickets, love notes from a time when things had been simpler, happier. The sight of it broke him. Stephen sank to the floor, clutching the box to his chest. The tears he had been holding back for weeks finally spilled over, his sobs echoing in the empty room. When he finally composed himself, he placed the box back where he'd found it and stood. This wasn't his home anymore. It wasn't their home anymore. Stephen left the house without looking back. The night air was crisp as he stepped outside, his car waiting in the driveway. He slid into the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. This was the end. He needed to accept that. As he drove away, the city lights blurred through his tears. Stephen vowed to start over, to bury the pain and move forward. But deep down, he knew that no matter how far he drove, he couldn't outrun the emptiness that Mia had left behind. Stephen sat at his desk, staring at the skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his new penthouse. It was a stunning view, the kind that most people would kill to have, but tonight it felt empty. Just like everything else in his life. The house he had shared with Mia was far behind him now, sold to a new family who would fill its halls with laughter and life. The papers were signed. The chapter was closed. He thought of that night often, the divorce papers, the pregnancy test, the weight of his own failure pressing down on him. For weeks, he had convinced himself that moving on was the only way forward. Yet, as he sat here, surrounded by the trappings of success, the void in his chest refused to be filled. Work became his refuge. Stephen threw himself into it with a ferocity that surprised even his closest colleagues. Meetings were scheduled back-to-back, and when there weren't meetings, there were calls, emails, and proposals demanding his attention. The company thrived under his relentless drive, breaking records and securing new partnerships that left the competition scrambling to keep up. But every night, when the office emptied out and silence reclaimed the space, the thoughts crept back in. He'd sit in the dark, nursing a glass of whiskey and wondering if Mia ever thought about him. If she ever regretted the way things had ended. Mia's silence was deafening. Not a single call, not even a message. It was as if she had vanished, erasing herself from his life completely. He had hoped, foolishly, that there might be some final words between them, something to give him closure, if nothing else. But there was nothing. At first, he'd resisted the urge to reach out to her. She needed space, and so did he, or so he told himself. But as weeks turned into months, the temptation grew harder to ignore. He found himself staring at her number on his phone, his thumb hovering over the call button. Each time, though, he stopped himself. Maybe this was for the best. His friends had plenty to say about it. "Let it go, Stephen," his longtime friend Marcus had said one night over drinks. "You've got everything a man could want. A thriving business, freedom to do whatever you want. Why are you still torturing yourself over her?" Stephen had forced a smile and raised his glass, pretending to agree. But deep down, he knew Marcus didn't understand. He didn't see the way Mia's absence had hollowed him out, how her memory lingered in every quiet moment. Even his sister Lauren, who had always been his fiercest advocate, urged him to move on. "Stephen, she's gone," Lauren said during one of her weekly check-ins. "You're only hurting yourself by holding on to the past. You deserve to be happy again." Happy. What a strange concept that felt like now. Stephen gave them both the answers they wanted to hear, nodding along and pretending to take their advice to heart. But late at night, when the world was asleep, he couldn't escape the truth. There were so many unanswered questions, so many things left unsaid. Had she been pregnant? Had she moved on? Did she hate him? The what-ifs clawed at him, refusing to let him rest. One particularly restless night, he found himself digging through an old box of keepsakes he'd brought from the house. He hadn't touched it since the move, but something about the silence of the evening compelled him to open it. Inside were remnants of their life together, photos from their honeymoon in Santorini, concert tickets from a show they'd impulsively attended, a silly drawing sheet made during a long layover at an airport. Each item was a punch to the gut, a reminder of what he had lost. As he sifted through the box, his hand brushed against an envelope at the bottom. It was addressed to him in Mia's handwriting, though the postmark suggested it had been sent months ago. He hadn't noticed it before. Heart pounding, he opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. It was brief, written in her neat, deliberate script. "Stephen, I don't know if this will ever reach you, or if you even care to read it. But I wanted to say that I'm sorry. For everything. For not being the wife you needed me to be, for not trusting you enough to let you in when it mattered most. I know we both made mistakes, and I don't know if we'll ever find our way back to the people we were when we first fell in love. But for what it's worth, I'll always remember those moments. The good ones. Take care of yourself. Mia." Stephen stared at the letter, reading it over and over until the words blurred together. She didn't mention a pregnancy. She didn't offer any hint of reconciliation. It was a goodbye, plain and simple. And yet there was something in the letter, something unsaid, that gnawed at him. It wasn't closure. It was a reminder of the life they had shared, the love that had once burned so brightly between them. He folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope, his hands shaking. Stephen knew he needed to let go. Mia had moved on. She had made her choice. But knowing and doing were two very different things. He rose from the couch and walked to the window, the city lights stretching out before him. Somewhere out there, Mia was living her life without him. Maybe she was happy. Maybe she wasn't. He would probably never know. As the hours stretched into dawn, Stephen resolved to keep moving forward. Not because he wanted to, but because he had no other choice. Work would be his anchor, his distraction. He would bury himself in the demands of his empire and leave the past where it belonged. But as the first rays of sunlight broke over the horizon, casting a warm glow over the city, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of their story. That somewhere, somehow, the threads of their lives would cross again. And when they did, he wasn't sure whether he'd be ready, or if he'd even know what to say. The first few months after the divorce were a blur for Mia. The life she had built with Stephen, the love they had shared, all felt like distant memories as she packed her belongings into boxes. The house that once echoed with laughter and arguments in equal measure now stood eerily silent. She moved deliberately, methodically, avoiding lingering too long on anything that might pull her back into the past. The day she discovered she was pregnant, everything changed. Mia had been feeling off for weeks, nausea in the mornings, an unshakable fatigue that clung to her even after hours of rest. At first, she thought it was stress, the emotional fallout of the divorce manifesting physically. But when she caught herself tearing up at a commercial about baby strollers, she couldn't ignore the possibility any longer. The test confirmed it. She was pregnant. Sitting on the bathroom floor, the positive results still clutched in her trembling hands, Mia's mind raced. A storm of emotions threatened to overwhelm her, shock, fear, and beneath it all, a flicker of something she hadn't felt in months, hope. But the hope was quickly smothered by doubt. Stephen didn't want this. He didn't want her. That much had been clear in the weeks leading up to their separation. She couldn't imagine telling him now, not after everything that had happened. He had been so distant, so consumed by his work, by his need to control every aspect of his life. What place was there for a child in his carefully curated world? If she told him, would he see it as an obligation, a burden? Mia closed her eyes and tried to steady her breathing. She wanted this baby. She had no idea how she was going to do it on her own, but she knew she would. The next few days were spent making arrangements. She sold the house, determined to leave behind the ghost of their marriage. The memories clung to every corner of that place, and she couldn't bear to stay. She moved to a small town a few hours away, a quiet place where no one knew her, where she could start over. It wasn't much, a modest cottage on the edge of a forest, far removed from the bustling city life she had once known. But it was hers, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sliver of peace. The early days of her pregnancy were a mix of joy and uncertainty. She spent hours poring over parenting books, researching everything from nutrition to prenatal exercises. Each milestone, hearing the baby's heartbeat for the first time, feeling those initial flutters of movement, filled her with a sense of wonder and purpose. But there were also moments of doubt, nights when she lay awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if she had made the right choice in keeping Stephen in the dark. She thought about calling him more times than she cared to admit. Her phone would sit on the table in front of her, his number glowing on the screen as she debated whether to press call. Each time, she convinced herself it was better this way. What would she even say? That she was pregnant? That she needed him? The words felt heavy, impossible to form. And deep down, she feared his response. Mia told herself she was protecting him as much as she was protecting herself. Stephen had always valued control, precision. A child was unpredictable, messy. Would he even want to be a part of this? Or would he see it as another complication in a life already packed to the brim with obligations? She didn't want to risk hearing him say it out loud. As the months passed, Mia began to find a rhythm in her new life. She took long walks in the woods, her boots crunching against the fallen leaves as she let the crisp air clear her mind. She joined a small prenatal yoga class, where she met other expectant mothers who offered her a sense of community she hadn't realized she needed. Her days were quiet, simple, but there was a strength in that simplicity. She painted the nursery herself, choosing soft yellows and greens that reminded her of spring. She built the crib with the help of a kind neighbor who had noticed her struggling with the instructions. There were still hard days, of course. Days when the loneliness crept in, when she missed the life she had once envisioned with Stephen. She tried not to dwell on it, tried to focus on the future. But there were times when she caught herself wondering how different things might have been if they had just held on a little longer. One evening, as she folded tiny onesies and placed them carefully into a drawer, Mia felt the baby kick for the first time. She froze, her hands still resting on the soft fabric. Then it came again, a small, fluttering movement that took her breath away. Tears welled up in her eyes, and for the first time in months, she didn't push them back. "Hi there, little one," she whispered, her hand gently resting on her growing belly. "It's just you and me for now. But we're going to be okay. I promise." The moment solidified something in her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was building something new, something beautiful. Mia began journaling, documenting every moment of her pregnancy, every thought and fear and hope. The journal became her companion, a place to pour out the emotions she couldn't share with anyone else. There were entries about the baby's first movements, about the names she was considering, about her dreams for their future. And there were entries about Stephen, letters she would never send, filled with the things she wished she could say. As her due date approached, Mia felt a growing sense of anticipation. The fear was still there, of course, it always would be. But it was tempered by a quiet confidence that she had found within herself. She didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if Stephen would ever learn the truth, or if he would even care if he did. But for now, that didn't matter. What mattered was the life she was creating, the love she already felt for the tiny person growing inside her. For the first time in what felt like forever, Mia felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. Stephen sat at the corner table of the grand ballroom, the low hum of chatter and clinking glasses swirling around him. The charity gala was the kind of event he attended out of obligation rather than genuine interest, another checkbox for his public image. Tonight, though, he found himself even more detached than usual. He sipped his drink absent-mindedly, the ice cubes rattling against the glass as his mind wandered. 9 months. It had been 9 months since the divorce. 9 months of trying to move forward, to let go of the life he once had with Mia. Yet, no matter how many deals he closed or accolades he received, there was always an emptiness that clung to him, a whisper of regret he couldn't quite shake. The sharp clack of heels brought him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Jessica Harrington, his cousin, approaching with a warm smile and a glass of champagne in hand. "Stephen," she greeted, leaning down to kiss him on the cheek. Still brooding, I see. You know these things are more enjoyable if you actually socialize. He forced a smile, raising his glass in a mock toast. Socializing isn't my strong suit these days. Jessica rolled her eyes and slid into the seat next to him. You're impossible. Anyway, I just ran into someone who mentioned Mia. Thought you'd want to hear. The mention of Mia's name sent a jolt through him. He hadn't heard anything about her since the divorce. He'd made a point not to ask, not to dig, convincing himself it was better that way. What about her? He asked, keeping his tone as casual as he could manage. Jessica took a sip of her champagne, her eyes scanning the room. Oh, nothing scandalous. Just that she's doing well. Settled into some small town upstate, I think. Oh, and she just had a baby. A boy, apparently. The words hit Stephen like a freight train. He stared at her, his glass frozen halfway to his lips. A baby? Jessica nodded, oblivious to the storm brewing behind his calm facade. Yeah. Sweet little thing, from what I hear. Her friend Sarah mentioned it to me earlier. They were shopping for baby clothes together last week. Guess she's really embracing the whole small-town mom vibe. Stephen barely heard the rest of her words. The room seemed to blur around him, the buzz of conversation fading into the background. A baby. Mia had a baby. The pregnancy test. The one he'd found in the trash that night. His mind raced, connecting the dots with a sickening clarity. Could it be? He swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. Did she say anything else? About the baby's father? Jessica frowned, tilting her head. No, not really. I assumed she moved on after you two split. Why? Stephen shook his head, forcing a tight smile. No reason. Just curious. Jessica gave him a curious look but didn't press further. She was quickly distracted by someone calling her name across the room, and with a cheerful wave, she excused herself, leaving Stephen alone with his spiraling thoughts. He sat there for what felt like an eternity, his mind replaying every detail of the past year. The pregnancy test he'd dismissed. Mia's silence. The timing. It all lined up. Panic clawed at his chest, his breaths coming in shallow gasps. If the baby was their baby, how could she not have told him? How could she have gone through this alone, keeping such a monumental truth from him? He stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the polished floor. Ignoring the curious glances from nearby guests, he made his way out of the ballroom, the air inside suddenly too stifling to bear. Outside, the cool night air hit him like a splash of water. He paced along the edge of the courtyard, his hands running through his hair as he tried to make sense of it all. The memories of their final days together came rushing back. Mia's distance, her uncharacteristic mood swings, the tension that had hung over them like a storm cloud. At the time, he chalked it up to the inevitable breakdown of their marriage. But now, in hindsight, it all pointed to something else. She had been pregnant. And he hadn't even noticed. The realization hit him with crushing weight. He had been so consumed by his own frustrations, his own hurt, that he hadn't seen what was right in front of him. He needed answers. Pulling out his phone, Stephen stared at Mia's number, his thumb hovering over the screen. He hadn't called her once since the divorce. Not because he didn't want to, but because he hadn't known what to say. Now, he had no choice. But as he prepared to press the button, doubt crept in. What if she didn't answer? Or worse, what if she did, and confirmed his fears? He clenched his jaw, lowering the phone. This wasn't a conversation to have over the phone. He needed to see her, to look her in the eyes and get the truth. The thought filled him with a renewed sense of urgency. He couldn't just sit back and let this go unanswered. If there was even the slightest chance that the baby was his, he had to know. Stephen's car roared to life as he sped away from the gala, his mind racing faster than the vehicle. He didn't have a plan, not yet, but he knew where to start. He would find Mia. And when he did, he would demand the truth. The city lights blurred past him as he drove, the weight of what he might discover pressing heavily on his chest. Somewhere, out there, was a child who might be his. And the thought of not knowing, of not being a part of that child's life, was something he couldn't bear. Stephen had spent the past 9 months trying to move on, trying to convince himself that his life with Mia was over. But now, everything had changed. The drive home from the gala was a blur. Stephen's mind churned with a relentless tide of thoughts and emotions. He barely noticed the familiar city streets, or the soft hum of his car's engine. The revelation about Mia, about the baby, had thrown his world into chaos. He couldn't stop picturing the life she must have now, a quiet existence in some small town, raising a child who might very well be his. The idea of it burned in his chest. How could she have kept this from him? When he finally stepped into his penthouse, the silence greeted him like an unwelcome guest. He set his keys down on the counter and leaned against it, staring blankly at the city lights twinkling in the distance. For years, this view had been his solace, a reminder of his success and the empire he'd built. But tonight, it felt meaningless. Stephen took a deep breath and reached for his phone. This wasn't something he could ignore, not now. If the child was his, he had a responsibility to be there, to be a father. No matter how much time had passed or how strained things were between him and Mia, he couldn't let this go unanswered. The first call he made was to his private investigator, a man he had relied on in the past for discreet matters. "Find Mia Whitaker," Stephen said, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside him. "She moved out of the city after the divorce. I need her current address. And be quick about it." The investigator didn't question him, he never did, and assured Stephen he'd start immediately. As Stephen hung up, he felt a pang of guilt. Was this the right way to go about it? Should he have tried contacting Mia directly instead of employing resources to track her down? But he knew Mia well enough to suspect she wouldn't make this easy. She had always been fiercely independent, and if she had chosen to keep the baby from him, she likely wouldn't be eager to let him back into her life now. Over the next few days, Stephen threw himself into his work as he waited for news. But even the relentless pace of meetings and negotiations couldn't distract him from the growing weight of what he was about to uncover. Late at night, when the city was quiet and his office was dark, he found himself reflecting on the choices that had led them here. He thought of the man he had been during their marriage, driven, ambitious, often blind to the needs of the person who had stood by his side. Had he truly been ready for fatherhood back then? Or would he have seen it as another complication, another demand on his already strained time? The truth was, he didn't know. But now, the idea of not being involved in his child's life filled him with a deep, aching regret. When the call finally came, Stephen's heart raced. The investigator had found Mia. She was living in a small town a few hours away, just as Jessica had mentioned. The house was modest, tucked away on a quiet street near the woods. There was no mention of anyone else in her life, no partner, no family. Just her and the baby. Stephen thanked the investigator and hung up, staring at the address scribbled on a notepad. It was real now. The next morning, Stephen was in his car, driving toward the town. As the cityscape gave way to rolling hills and dense forests, he rehearsed what he might say. How could he even begin this conversation? How could he explain the months of silence, the anger and hurt that had kept them apart? But as he neared the town, another thought gnawed at him. What if she refused to see him? What if she slammed the door in his face and shut him out completely? Meanwhile, Mia was just finishing breakfast when she noticed a text from Sarah, her close friend. "Stephen's looking for you," it read. Mia froze, her heart pounding. She reread the message, hoping she had misunderstood, but the words remained the same. She set her phone down and took a shaky breath. For months she had been bracing for this moment, the possibility that Stephen might find out about the baby. But now that it was happening, she felt utterly unprepared. Mia looked toward the nursery, where her son, Jonathan, was napping peacefully. His tiny chest rose and fell with each breath, his hand clutching the corner of a soft blanket. How could she let Stephen back into their lives? The pain of their past was still raw, and she wasn't sure she could face it all over again. But at the same time, she knew she couldn't deny him the chance to know his son. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Mia couldn't focus on anything, her thoughts consumed by the inevitable confrontation. Would Stephen be angry? Would he demand custody? Or worse, would he decide he didn't want to be involved at all? By late afternoon, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway made her heart stop. She peered through the curtains and saw him, Stephen, stepping out of a sleek black car, his expression unreadable. Mia's first instinct was to hide, to pretend she wasn't home. But she quickly dismissed the idea. This wasn't something she could avoid. Taking a deep breath, she opened the door just as Stephen reached the front steps. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They stood there, two people who had once been everything to each other, now separated by a gulf of unspoken words and unresolved feelings. "Mia," Stephen said finally, his voice softer than she had expected. She crossed her arms, her guard up. "Stephen, what are you doing here?" "I had to see you," he said, his eyes searching hers. "I heard about the baby." Mia's heart sank. This was it, the moment she had dreaded. "I didn't tell you because I didn't think you'd want to know," she said, her voice trembling. "You made it clear that I didn't know." He interrupted, his tone firm but not angry. "If I had, things would have been different." Mia stared at him, unsure of how to respond. She had spent months convincing herself that Stephen wouldn't want to be part of their lives. But now, looking at him, she wasn't so sure. "Can I come in?" he asked, glancing past her toward the house. She hesitated, her instincts telling her to say no. But then she thought of Jonathan, sleeping peacefully in the nursery, and the choice was made for her. With a nod, she stepped aside, letting Stephen into the life she had built without him. The living room was small, cozy, and worlds away from the sleek, modern spaces Stephen was accustomed to. He stood awkwardly by the doorway as Mia gestured for him to sit, his eyes scanning the room. It was warm and inviting, filled with little touches that reflected her personality, soft throws draped over the couch, a collection of books stacked on the coffee table, and the faint smell of lavender lingering in the air. But what caught his attention most was the small bouncer chair near the corner, its colorful toys dangling from the frame. It was unmistakable proof of the life he had come to find. Mia cleared her throat, pulling his gaze back to her. She stood stiffly by the kitchen counter, her arms crossed as if bracing herself for a storm. "Do you want something to drink?" she asked, her tone clipped. "No, I'm fine," Stephen replied, his voice low. The tension between them was palpable, an invisible wall separating them despite the few feet of physical distance. Mia moved to the couch and sat down, leaving him to take the armchair across from her. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, both unsure of how to begin. "You didn't tell me," Stephen finally said, his voice filled with a mix of hurt and accusation. Mia flinched, but she held her ground. "I didn't think it would change anything. We were already over, Stephen. I didn't see the point in dragging you into something you didn't want. You didn't even give me the chance." He shot back, leaning forward. "You decided for me, about my own child." Her jaw tightened, and she looked away. "You were barely present during our marriage. How was I supposed to believe you'd want to be part of this?" Stephen's hands clenched into fists. "I made mistakes, Mia. I know that. But you didn't think I deserved to know? To even have the choice?" Mia's eyes filled with unshed tears as she turned back to him. "You were so distant, Stephen. Every time I tried to talk to you, it was like you were already halfway out the door. I didn't think you'd care. And I couldn't take the risk of hearing you say you didn't." Her words cut deep, and Stephen felt the sting of her accusations. But beneath his anger, there was guilt that she might have been right. "I care now," he said, his voice quieter but no less firm. "I'm here now." The silence between them stretched, heavy with everything they weren't saying. Finally, Mia sighed and stood. "There's someone you should meet." Stephen's heart pounded as she disappeared down the hallway. When she returned a moment later, she was cradling a tiny bundle in her arms. "Stephen," she said softly, her eyes meeting his. "This is Jonathan." Time seemed to stop as Stephen stared at the baby in her arms. Jonathan was small and delicate, his tiny hand peeking out from the blanket to clutch at Mia's shirt. His eyes, a deep shade of blue, blinked sleepily as if trying to make sense of the world around him. Stephen stood, his legs unsteady beneath him. "Can I?" Mia hesitated for a moment before nodding. She stepped closer, carefully transferring Jonathan into Stephen's waiting arms. Stephen held him as if he were made of glass, his hands trembling slightly. Jonathan squirmed, his face scrunching up for a moment before settling against Stephen's chest. The rush of emotion was overwhelming. Stephen felt a lump rise in his throat as he stared down at his son, his mind struggling to process the reality of it. This tiny human was his child. "He's beautiful," Stephen whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Mia watched him, her guard softening as she saw the look on his face. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, Stephen truly did care. "He's 6 months old," she said quietly. "Born in March. He loves music, especially lullabies. And he hates peas." Stephen chuckled softly, his eyes never leaving Jonathan. "I'll keep that in mind." The tension in the room eased slightly, replaced by a tentative sense of connection. As Stephen gently rocked Jonathan, he looked up at Mia. "Why didn't you tell me? Really? Was it just because you thought I wouldn't care, or was it something else?" Mia sighed and sat down on the couch. "I was scared, Stephen. Scared of how you'd react, scared of dragging Jonathan into a situation that wasn't stable. And honestly, I didn't know if I could handle dealing with you on top of everything else." Her honesty struck a chord in him. He could see now how much she had been carrying on her own, how much strength it had taken for her to start over. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "For everything. For not being there when you needed me, for letting things get so bad between us. I can't change the past, but I want to be part of Jonathan's life. If you'll let me." Mia studied him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she nodded. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy," she said. "But he deserves to know his father. And maybe we can figure the rest out as we go." Relief washed over Stephen, and he gave her a small, grateful smile. For the first time in months, he felt a glimmer of hope, a fragile, tentative hope that this wasn't the end of their story, but the beginning of something new. Jonathan stirred in his arms, letting out a small, contented sigh. And as Stephen looked down at his son, he knew one thing for certain: whatever it took, he was going to be there for him. For Jonathan. For Mia. For the family they might still have a chance to become. Stephen left Mia's house that evening with a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. The drive back to the city felt longer than it was, each mile giving him time to reflect on the life he'd just seen, a life he had been absent from. Jonathan's tiny face and the weight of his small body in Stephen's arms stayed etched in his mind. The child wasn't just a revelation, he was a second chance, a reason to do better. For too long, Stephen had buried himself in work, chasing success and control as if they could fill the voids in his life. But seeing Jonathan had shifted something fundamental in him. He couldn't afford to be the man he'd been before, the man who prioritized boardrooms over living rooms, meetings over moments that mattered. He had to change. Not just for Jonathan but for Mia, too. The next morning, Stephen cleared his schedule and sat at his desk, staring at a blank notebook. His instincts pushed him toward action, but this time he wanted to be deliberate. Thoughtful. He began jotting down ideas, ways to make space in his life for Jonathan, how he could show Mia he was serious about being there, ways to rebuild the trust he had shattered. His first step was the most obvious: time. He began carving out regular days to visit Mia and Jonathan, scheduling them as immovable appointments in his calendar. It wasn't easy at first. Work had always demanded his attention, and stepping back felt unnatural. But when he thought of Jonathan, it became easier to draw those boundaries. The visits started small. Stephen would arrive with groceries or a toy for Jonathan, careful not to overstep. He spent hours on the floor playing with his son, marveling at every laugh, every new discovery. Jonathan's joy was contagious, a light that seemed to brighten even the hardest days. For Mia, it was harder. She watched Stephen's efforts with guarded eyes, unsure if this transformation was real or temporary. She appreciated his commitment to Jonathan but found it difficult to let go of her doubts. One evening, after Stephen had read Jonathan a bedtime story and helped tuck him in, Mia stood in the doorway of the nursery, her arms crossed. "You're really trying," she said softly, her tone a mix of surprise and skepticism. Stephen turned to face her, his expression earnest. "I have to, Mia. For Jonathan. And for you, if you'll let me." She nodded but didn't say more. It was progress, but Stephen knew trust wouldn't come easily. Determined to show her he was serious, Stephen began making changes to his life outside of his visits. He delegated more responsibilities at work, empowering his team to handle decisions he would have once micromanaged. He started attending parenting workshops and reading books on fatherhood, learning everything he could to support Jonathan's development. He also began addressing the emotional distance that had plagued their marriage. He started therapy, determined to understand the patterns that had driven him to prioritize work over relationships. It wasn't easy to confront his flaws, but he knew it was necessary. Mia noticed the changes, even if she didn't acknowledge them right away. She saw the way Stephen's visits became a consistent part of their lives, how he showed up not just physically but emotionally. She saw him sitting on the floor with Jonathan, building block towers and clapping enthusiastically when they toppled over. She heard the softness in his voice when he read bedtime stories, the genuine affection that had once felt so out of reach. Still, her doubts lingered. One afternoon, as they sat on the porch watching Jonathan play with a set of stacking rings, Mia finally voiced what she had been holding back. "Why now, Stephen?" she asked, her gaze fixed on their son. "Why couldn't you have been this person before?" Stephen's chest tightened at the question. He thought carefully before answering. "I don't have an excuse," he admitted. "I got caught up in my own world and my own priorities, and I didn't see what I was losing until it was too late. I failed you, Mia. And I'll never stop regretting that." She turned to look at him, her expression guarded. "And what happens when work gets busy again? When something else demands your attention?" "I'm not that man anymore," Stephen said, meeting her eyes. "I won't let work take over my life again. I can't. Jonathan has changed everything for me." "You've changed everything." Mia studied him for a long moment, as if searching for cracks in his resolve. Finally, she nodded, though her expression remained cautious. "I want to believe you," she said quietly. "But it's going to take time." Stephen accepted her words with a nod, knowing that rebuilding trust was a slow process. He didn't expect her to forgive him overnight. All he could do was keep showing up, proving his commitment one day at a time. As the weeks passed, the rhythm of their lives began to shift. Stephen's presence became a steady fixture, and Mia found herself letting her guard down little by little. One evening, after Jonathan had fallen asleep, Mia and Stephen sat on the couch, sharing a rare moment of quiet. "I see it, you know," Mia said, breaking the silence. "See what?" Stephen asked, turning to her. "The effort. The way you've changed," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't think it was possible, but you're proving me wrong." Stephen's heart swelled at her words, but he kept his response measured. "It's because I finally realized what matters. And it's not the company or the deals or the accolades. It's this. It's you and Jonathan." Mia smiled faintly, her gaze dropping to her hands. I'm scared, Stephen. Of letting you back in and getting hurt again." He reached out, hesitating for a moment before resting his hand over hers. "I know. And I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you don't have to feel that way again." The gesture was small, but it spoke volumes. For the first time in a long time, Mia felt a flicker of hope, not just for Jonathan, but for herself. As the night wore on, the conversation shifted to lighter topics, and for a moment, it felt like old times. Laughter replaced tension, and the connection they had once shared began to resurface. Stephen knew there was still a long road ahead, but he also knew that this was the first step towards something better, for the family they were beginning to rebuild. The days turned into weeks, and then months. Stephen's visits became part of the rhythm of life for both Mia and Jonathan. The cautious, tentative atmosphere that had once surrounded their interactions began to fade, replaced by something warmer, more natural. It wasn't immediate, nor was it effortless, but slowly, piece by piece, they were building something new. Stephen made good on his promises. He didn't miss a single visit, no matter how busy work became. He learned the nuances of Jonathan's routines, the way he loved to grab at his father's tie when Stephen leaned in close, the way his giggles erupted when Mia sang silly songs during bath time. Stephen marveled at how quickly Jonathan was growing, how his tiny hands now reached confidently for his father, how his first tooth had come in seemingly overnight. Mia couldn't help but notice the changes in Stephen. The man who had once been consumed by his career now seemed fully present. She watched him kneel on the floor to stack blocks with Jonathan, his laughter genuine and unrestrained when his son knocked them over with a triumphant squeal. She saw how he listened to her now, really listened, during their late-night talks on the porch after Jonathan had gone to bed. It was during one of those evenings, as they sat side by side, that Stephen broached a topic neither of them had fully addressed. "Do you ever think about us?" he asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the stars above. "About what we had?" Mia hesitated, her hands gripping the mug of tea in her lap. "I do," she admitted, her voice soft. "But I also think about how much it hurt when it all fell apart." Stephen nodded, his jaw tightening. "I think about that too. I think about how much I let you down, how I didn't see what was right in front of me. And I hate that I put you through that." Mia turned to him, her expression unreadable. "You've changed, Stephen. I see it. But I'm still scared. What if we try again, and it doesn't work? What if Jonathan gets caught in the middle?" "I don't have all the answers," Stephen said, his voice steady. "But I know one thing, I'm not the man I used to be. And I'll spend the rest of my life proving that to you if that's what it takes." Mia didn't respond right away. Instead, she leaned back in her chair and let the silence settle between them, her thoughts a whirlwind of doubts and possibilities. But for the first time, the idea of a future with Stephen didn't feel so impossible. As they continued to navigate their new normal, their moments together grew less strained and more natural. They began spending time as a family, picnics in the park, lazy afternoons at Mia's house, quiet evenings reading bedtime stories to Jonathan. The laughter they shared during those times felt easy, unforced, and it stirred something deep within Mia that she had thought was long buried. Stephen, too, felt the shift. He caught glimpses of the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago, the way she tilted her head when she laughed, the determined spark in her eyes when she was focused on something. And each time he saw those pieces of her, it strengthened his resolve to rebuild what they had lost. One evening, after Jonathan had taken his first wobbly steps across the living room, Stephen and Mia found themselves sitting on the couch, their son asleep in Mia's arms. The moment felt intimate, like a fragile bubble they didn't want to burst. "You're really good with him," Mia said, breaking the silence. "Better than I thought you'd be." Stephen smiled, his eyes soft as he looked at Jonathan. "He makes it easy. He's everything I didn't know I needed." Mia studied him for a moment, her heart aching at the sincerity in his voice. "I didn't think you'd want this life. I didn't think you could fit it into the one you already had." "I didn't think so either," Stephen admitted. "But now that I'm here, I can't imagine anything else." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Mia let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Maybe we could try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Stephen turned to her, his eyes searching hers. "What do you mean?" "I mean," Mia hesitated, her fingers brushing over Jonathan's soft hair. "I mean, maybe we could see if there's still something here. For Jonathan's sake, if nothing else." Stephen's chest swelled with hope, but he kept his response measured. I don't want to rush you, Mia. I want this to be right. For all of us. She nodded, her lips curving into a small, tentative smile. One step at a time. And so they began again, not as the couple they once were, but as two people determined to create something stronger. They leaned on each other, learning to forgive and trust in ways they hadn't before. It wasn't always easy, old wounds still surfaced from time to time, but they faced them together, knowing what was at stake. Months later, on a sunny afternoon, Stephen found himself in the backyard of Mia's house, holding Jonathan as they watched Mia hang a string of paper lanterns for a small family gathering. Jonathan babbled happily in his father's arms, his tiny hand reaching for the bright colors swaying in the breeze. As Stephen looked at Mia, his heart swelled with gratitude. He had come so close to losing everything, and yet, here he was, surrounded by a life he could never have imagined. A life he almost didn't realize he wanted. Thank you, he said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. Mia turned, her brow furrowed in confusion. For what? For giving me another chance, Stephen said, his gaze steady. For letting me be part of this. Of him. Of us. Mia smiled, the warmth in her eyes filling him with a sense of peace he hadn't felt in years. We're all learning, Stephen. But I think we're getting there. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting a golden glow over the yard, Stephen held Jonathan close and thought about how far they had come. This was his family, his second chance, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. For the first time in a long time, Stephen felt truly whole. As the sun sets on Stephen, Mia, and Jonathan's story, we're reminded that life's second chances often come from unexpected places. Through commitment, growth, and the willingness to face their flaws, Stephen and Mia found a way to rebuild not just for their son, but for themselves. Their journey shows us that redemption is possible when we truly dedicate ourselves to it, and that love, no matter how battered, can find its way back. What did you think of their story? Have you ever experienced a second chance that changed your life? Let us know in the comments below. And if this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartfelt tales like this one. See you in the next video.